audience. Today we are going to present to you our research study. This research study is the practices that permit intensive intermediate English to students, enhance cohesive sentences in the building up section of the written test at the Western Multidisciplinary Campus of the University of El Salvador in 2009. This study is presented by Campus Méndez Alejandra, Díaz Durán, Jorge Alberto, and Ortega Laura Clarisa. We have the introduction to this research study, and this study focuses on the practices that helped students improve the elaboration of cohesive sentences in the building up section of the written text. So, also this study is divided in 5 chapters. The first one is a statement of the problem, which describes the problem, and also it contained the objective for this research study, as well as the importance that this research study had. Also, in the chapter 2, we have the theoretical framework, in which it shows the theory that support this research study. Also, we have the chapter 3, which is the methodological design, which contains the instrument that researchers use to carry out this study. And also we have chapter 4, which is the analysis and interpretation of data, in which here is the results that researchers gather after passing the instrument. And also we have chapter 5, with the conclusion and recommendation of this research study. So we are going to start with the chapter 1, a statement of the problem. Here, in the Mayor of Licenciatura en Idioma Inglés Opción Enseñanza of the Western Multidisciplinary Campus of the University of El Salvador, students have to take 5 levels of English. Those are intensive basic English, intensive intermediate English 1, intensive intermediate English 2, intensive advanced English 1, and intensive advanced English 2. But for this research study, only intensive intermediate English 2 students, group 5, were used. So we go over the description of the problem. Here, the students take a written exam, which is divided into 5 parts. But it was shown that students have difficulty when solving building up sentences. Building up sentences, well, can be described as a set of grammatical structures combined with words that are called idioms, phrases, or words taken from context for students to build or to construct or make sentences from scratch, just following a pattern respecting grammatical rules and composition rules that make entire students to get a sentence that is logic, complete, and understandable. But where this building up section comes from? Well, this building up section comes from the autolingual method. This autolingual method is a method which uses drills and pattern practices in teaching language. And inside of this method, we have the restoration activity, which the aim of this activity is to build up sentences following a sequence of words. For example, we have kids waiting at school and school bus. Here, students have to create a sentence using these patterns. For example, when students write a sentence, so following this, we have kids are waiting for a school bus. The same happens with the students at the University of El Salvador. In the building up section, they have to create sentences following certain patterns. For example, third person plural, affirmative, have to, and coffee. So they have to create sentences using those using those parts. So after passing some instruments, researchers found out that students have difficulties when solving building up patterns. So first of all, an observation guide was implemented, and here researchers found out that not all the students could finish the 6 building up items in the test in an estimated time of 15 minutes. This is very important because when students have this written exam, they have a specific time to develop the whole exam. So they have to divide their time when solving this exam. So also the majority of the students didn't know the features that compose a pattern in the building up section. Here researchers realized that the students were asking others the meaning of some of the features contained in the building up sentences. So they didn't know the meaning and they couldn't identify as well. Also, the diagnostic test was implemented. This was a pattern practices similar to the one in the test. And here researchers found out that they confuse countable nouns with non-countable nouns. For example, when they have non-countable nouns, they use books or candies instead of sugar or butter. Also, students confuse the type of pronouns. For example, when they were asked to write a third person plural, that they use the second person plural. They use we instead of they. And also, a questionnaire was implemented after this diagnostic test. And here we took as an example some of the questions that were in that questionnaire. And we realized that 37% of the students found the building up section very difficult to do. And the 59% of the students say that they understand the features. But at the moment that the researchers went over from this instrument, they realized that they found really difficult this part, and also that they didn't understand the feature. So, as a result, after observing the problems, each student has the following inquiries right. What practices will increase intensive intermediate English to a student's performance in the elaboration of cohesive sentences in the building up section of the written test at the Western Multidisciplinary Campus of the University of El Salvador, Semester 1, 2019. The next one is how will intensive intermediate English to a student enhance their performance in the elaboration of sentences during the building up section of the written test through journal entries in pattern practices. And the other one is which factors prevent intensive intermediate to students to write cohesive sentences in the building up section of the written test. So as a result, the researchers had 2 variables, one independent and 2 dependent. So we have in the independent variable the pattern practices, which were pattern practices similar to the one in the test. Also, we have dependent variables, the journal entries in which researchers gave a specific topic, a specific vocabulary, and also a specific tenses in which they had to write a journal. And also cohesive sentences, because when writing pattern practices and also journal entries, it's really important that students write with cohesion. They have to write cohesive sentences. And we have the objectives. So we have our general objective that says to describe the type of practices that permit intensive intermediate English to students to enhance cohesive sentence in the building up section of the written test at the Western Multidisciplinary Campus of the University of El Salvador, 2019. The specific objectives. objectives are to enhance intensity in terminal English to student performance in the elaboration of sentences during the building up section of the written text through journal entries and pattern practices. And the second one says to describe the factors that prevent intensive intermediate English to students to write cohesive sentences in the building up section of the written text. Also, we have our hypothesis that says intensive intermediate English to students of licenciatura en idioma inglés opción enseñanza will improve the elaboration of cohesive sentences in the building up section of the written text through the implementation of journal weekly entries and building up parent practices in classes at the Western Multidisciplinary Campus of the University of El Salvador. Okay, now we will go over to the justification, and here we are going to see the importance of this research study. So we have that this is really important because it examines which practices increase intensive intermediate English to students' performance in the creation of cohesive sentences. Here are the practices that were used was journal entries and pattern practices. And also, it benefits intensive intermediate English to students when writing sentences during the building up section of the written text through journal entries and pattern practice. Here, researchers wanted to know if these instruments could help these students, and also it verified if the practices were meaningful and effective. So if these journal entries and pattern practices really help the students to write cohesive sentences, or if they did. Also, we have the scope of the research, which says this research study focused on the practices that permit intensive intermediate English to students and enhance coherent sentences in the building up section of the written text at the Western Multidisciplinary Campus of the University of El Salvador in 2019 by submitting pattern practices and journal entries. Okay, now we will go over the chapter 2, which is the theoretical framework. Here we have the building up and the background. So as already mentioned, this building up came from the autolingual method. Even though this autolingual method focuses on oral drill, also combining with this method and building up, they create sentences using patterns. But also we have the grammar translation method. But how this grammar translation method help this building up section? Well, this grammar translation method consists of how students learn by translating words or sentences. For example, from the native language to the foreign language. For example, when they try to translate something, they learn that sentences have a specific order. For example, has its own structure. For example, the sentences must have a subject, verb, and complement. So when they translate these sentences, they realize the order that those sentences have. So it's really important. So the autolingual method combined with the grammar translation method form the building up section. And also it's really important to mention that when we have building up sentences, it's really important to know that they students have to write with cohesion. They have to write cohesive sentences. Also, it's really important to have the elaboration of sentences. So here we have the lexicon and selection of restrictions. It is really important because when writing sentences, it is really important to know the type of subject that we have, the type of tense that we have, and sentences has its own structure, words have its own structure as well. For example, if we have the subject, well, if we have the word girl, we know that this girl has to be plus anime, plus human, and minus male because it's a female. So it is really important to follow those selection and restriction, because in that way students will realize if the type of subject that they will use match with the verb text as well. Because if we have girl or we have boy, we know that in the verb tense we have to use as a third person singular. Also with the vocabulary. Vocabulary is really important because it helps the students to write sentences. Since they have vocabulary, they will be able to use a limited number of words. Also, we have a spelling mistake. This is spelling mistake. This is as Peter stated that spelling mistakes came from the poor memory that students have, and also when they use or they depend so much for computers and also for a dictionary because they don't realize the mistake that they are doing, because when they have to do an assignment, they go over the computer or a dictionary and they don't realize the mistakes. So they use that, but they don't create their own sentences, and they don't make their own mistakes. And also semantics is really important because semantics deal with cohesion. So if a sentence is well constructed and it has the whole structure, but if that sentence doesn't have semantics, so it is wrong. It is totally wrong, because semantics deals with the meaning that the sentence can have. So it's really important, because to have a structure, to have the grammar structure correctly, and also the meaning of that sentence, which make a cohesive sentences, to have a meaning and also to have well grammar structure. And also problems and tasks that make the student face to write cohesive sentences in the building up section of the written test. So here researchers could realize that students have difficulty when identifying some verb tenses. For example, they mix some verb tenses. For example, near future with future prediction. So they use going to instead of will. And also sometimes they could identify the future, but they couldn't apply sentences. And also we have coherence. Why? Because they write sentences, but the sentences were not that meaningful, because maybe the sentence have the whole structure. I mean, the parents that were or the teachers that were asked, but the sentence have no meaning. And also they use two types of tenses at the same time. For example, they mix simple present with present continuous. For example, they say, "I am doing my homework." So they were using the auxiliary am, but they don't use the ing form for the verb do. So in this case, it has to be "I am doing my homework," but they wrote "I am doing my homework." So what are some of the mistakes that researchers could found in this research study? It's really important to say that those mistakes were found at the beginning when a diagnostic test
continue with chapter number 2, I'm going to describe the type of practices in building apps. First of all, we have practices that teachers use, practices that students do themselves, and the practices that enhance students' performance. In this part, we as researchers have suggested some practices that will enhance the elaboration of cohesive sentence in the building up section. So let's start. In the first practice that teachers do for students to evaluate knowledge in the building up section, we have pattern practices. These are the only practices that teachers use to enhance cohesive sentence in the building up section of the written test. So this practice is based on isolated features like tenses, auxiliaries, and vocabulary. And why do I say isolated features? Well, it is because teachers just give them the features, but they don't explain or they don't use grammar concepts to the students to explain how this feature is created in a sentence. That is why this also needs grammar concepts that are going to be needed in future investigation, because as we create practices, we need to give them concepts for to students to grasp the contents better. As Wood, Runner, and Ross 1966, they claim that a student or a learner that learns a new concept at the beginning, he or she needs the help of another person with more experience, in this case, the teacher. So also we have that this goes straight to the point, because as we are going to see, these practices are the real ones that students are going to receive in the real test. And also they put into practice sentence structure, how to create sentence in context. But it is not enough, because students need to have more deeper activities or exercises to have a better understanding of the features. Also, we have the type of practices that students do by themselves. In this part, we have that students only review practices in the book and practices in the handouts, such as filling the blanks, multiple choice, role plays, WH questions, previous tests, and as we can see, there is no other practice that students do outside the classroom. They need to put into practice their knowledge with other activities, but okay, this is not enough for a student, because they need to have more activities related to building it. And that is why we as researchers have suggested these two practices for the enhancement of cohesive sentence in the building up section. And the first one is practices based on journal entries. In this practice, it is evaluated how well students grasp the contents, such as tenses, vocabulary, grammar notes, and so forth. They put into practice how to connect their ideas in a specific number of lines in a paragraph. This is really important, because we are going to make students to contextualize the sentences and trying to think about how to put into real words their ideas. So it is very important for them to have this practice before the coming test. The other one that we suggest as researchers is practices based on patterns. This practice is essential for students since it is similar as the actual part of the written exam. They are asked to create sentences from the given features so that they should write cohesive sentence. With this practice, we have found that this is the more suitable practice for students to enhance the elaboration of cohesive sentence in building up section, because they are going to see the features that compose a building up, and they are going to analyze them so that they can write a cohesive sentence in this part. So this is this must be implemented for students, because this is the practice that goes straight to the point. They need to know the features, they need to know grammar concepts, and they need to put into practice their ideas into real words. So basically, these are the information that we have gathered from this research study. Okay, to continue with chapter number 3, we have the methodological design. This is how we create this research work and how the methodology that we use to put into real words all the research that we have gathered. Okay, let's start with the paradigm and the type of study. This research study was under the mixed method, which was quantitative and qualitative. Also, the type of study is quasi-experimental and descriptive. Why quasi-experimental? Okay, quasi-experimental because it was developed in a manipulated environment and it attempts to establish a cause-effect relationship among the variables. And we have also the control of the variables during all the investigation so that we have a better point of view about how we are going to describe the practices and also this research study. Then we have the description of the environment. In the description of the environment, we focus on licenciatura en idioma inglés, sección de enseñanza, in the group Intensive Intermediate English 2, semester 1, 2019, in the University of El Salvador at the Western Multidisciplinary Campus. This university is located in Avenue Fray Felipe de Jesus Moraga at the south of Santana City in El Salvador. So the phenomenon took place in this environment. To continue with, we have the units of observation. In the units of observation, we have two. The first one is students from the subject Intensive Intermediate English 2 of the major of licenciatura en idioma inglés, sección de enseñanza of the University of El Salvador at the Western Multidisciplinary Campus. Also, we have the students' enhancement of cohesive sentences in the building up section of the written test at the Western Multidisciplinary Campus of the University of El Salvador. These are the two units of analysis of our research study. Okay, the sampling procedure that we have is the following. The target population consists of 200 students from the subject Intensive Intermediate English 2. In this subject, it is divided into 5 groups of around 40 students per each. So we decided to use a purposive sampling procedure because we as researchers found that all the predefined groups, all the students of Intensive Intermediate English 2, all of them accomplish the unit of observation. So, however, we decided just to take group number 5 to analyze. Okay, in the operationalization of the variables, we started this research study by focusing on the general and specific objective. Just to mention, the general objective is to describe the type of practices that permit intensive intermediate English to students to enhance cohesive sentence in the building up section of the written test. Also, we have specific objectives to enhance the performance in the elaboration of sentences through journal entries and pattern practices. Also, we have the last specific objective is to describe the factors that permit intensive intermediate English students to write cohesive sentence in the building up section of the written test. Okay, with this we try to analyze how we are going to operationalize the variables. So we found that the hypothesis is based on the general and specific objectives. So is in the following way. Intensive intermediate English 2 students will enhance the performance in the elaboration of cohesive sentence through journal entries and pattern practices. So this hypothesis will be answered later on in the analysis and data of the data. Okay, we are going to continue with the units of observation, which are students of intensity mean and industry, and the enhancement of the elaboration of cohesive sentences. Okay, the paradox. We are going to take a better look right here because we are going to try to analyze in a deeper way. So we have two independent variables and one dependent variable. The two independent variables are the following: a weekly journal entry, and the other one is building up pattern practice. And the dependent one is cohesive sentences in the building up section of the written exam. So a weekly journal entry is a journal, a written collection of feelings and thoughts, a place where students record opinions and events, and in which they can write either in a computer or in a notebook. Also, we have building up pattern practices. In this part, we have that building up pattern are grammatical features that have to be combined to create coherent sentences. And also, the dependent variable is that a cohesive sentence is the one that must be able to stick together, and it must have cohesion, the ability to stand alone in the independent sentence. So basically, these are the variables that we have for this research study. As soon as they start practicing with these two parts, they are going to improve the elaboration of cohesive sentences. And we have the indicators per one of each. Okay? And for journals, we have the indicators are the following. We are going to analyze that they need to write a topic of a student's preference, a specific tense, a established number of paragraph, and each paragraph needs to have an established number of lines. Also, we have to focus on the usage of specific vocabulary, and also we are going to grade how they can smoothly make the transitions between sentences, and also the common mistakes. For pattern practices, we are going to see that the indicators are the following: usage of a specific tense, no misspelling words, usage of all the given grammatical features in the patterns, the development of established number of building up patterns in the specific time, common mistakes, and the usage of vocabulary words. As well as they complete these practices, we are going to also focus on writing cohesive sentences. If they can write cohesive sentences, for example, we are going to see if they have logical and coherent sentences, complete features, correct usage of grammar, vocabulary, good use of punctuation, avoiding of shifting intent, avoiding of cheating person, avoiding wordiness, and an excellent word choice. These are the parts that compose these variables, and we are going to implement these practices through an observation guide, pattern practices, journal entry practices, and also we are going to use documentary observation. We are going to use this at the moment. We have used this to analyze the practice that we have. Okay, the data collection instrument that we have are the following. At the beginning, we use some tools to gather the information to start working on chapter number 1 and chapter number 2. And we have an observation guide, quiz, questionnaire, semi-controlled interview, face-to-face interview. These were the most useful tools that we have, that we use for the creation of the chapter number 1 and chapter number 2. And then for the analysis of the data that we collected, After we have implemented the practices, we have journal entry practices, building up pattern practices, written evaluations, observation guide, documentary observation, and questionnaires. These were the tools that we used after the implementation of and during the implementation of the practices that we have. Then we have how we approach the field. At the beginning, we identify the problem. As we identify the problem, then we selected the group. Then that we have selected the group, as I mentioned before, we ask for permission to analyze the group to the teachers and to the students. Then we present it and explain the project to students so that they can have a better view of what we were going to do. And also, after that, we implemented the practices that we had, and also we as researchers observed. Some of them were at the back, some of them were around the classroom to check if the students were doing all the practices. Then we analyze the environment. If we have the opportunity to have a better view of the problem, and if we identify some irregularities during this process. And then, at the end, we thank the students and teachers for the help that they provide to us. Okay, with the validation of the collection instruments, we have validity and reliability. For the phase validity, we have chosen this because we have to make sure that the operationalization of variables and hypotheses were carried out in the correct way, so that we have results that are more suitable for this investigation. Also, we have content validity. And in content validity, we have that researchers check all the questions from the instruments and the tools that we have, and we check them in order to avoid confusion and ambiguity in this part. Also, reliability, we have the consistency that we try to implement all these tools more than one time, because we have 3 practices that we gave to students in order to see if there were some tendencies, but we didn't find any. So we have homogeneity, that this is also related that we have to provide sentences and provide practices for students that have that are going to be created in the same way that we have created other tools. For example, we have pattern practices, and we have the pattern practices from the written test. So for the homogeneity, we have found that the practices must have the same characteristics from the ones from the written test. In this way, we can have results that are more reliable in this research study. And finally, we have ethical aspects such as social background, anonymity, plagiarism, integrity, social responsibility, and transparency. And in social background, we take into account all the aspects such as gender, race, and the environment. In anonymity, we face also that all the teachers and the students that help us to do this research study, we didn't mention in public the names of them, so that they want to be anonymous in the part of the practice that we provide. Also, plagiarism, all the citations that we got here are also related to books, magazines, and all the information that we got are also based on books and material that is real. Okay? Then we have integrity. As soon as we give them practices, and we didn't write any name of them, we didn't we mentioned them, but we didn't say any name of them, of the students. Also, we have social responsibility, which is that we as students and as researchers, we took the responsibility to do this research study. And also, students were also giving us the opportunity to work with them. And transparency is that we got the information, we analyzed the information, and we didn't manipulate anything, so that all the information that we have here is real. So this is all for chapter number 3.
Okay, so we're going to continue with chapter 4, which is the analysis and interpretation of data. This chapter contains a description of the type of practices that will permit intensive intermediate to students to enhance cohesive sentences in the building of section. Also, this chapter contains information about the different factors that affect intensive intermediate to students to write cohesive sentences at the building of section of the written test. All the data collected comes from questionnaires, face-to-face interviews, written evaluations, written practices, and also observation guides. The data was interpreted and organized by the research team using different graphs and tables. And the data was analyzed as follows. We have a description of the practices that help students to write cohesive sentences in the building up section of the written test. As it is known, intensive intermediate to students take a written test, which evaluates all the knowledge grasped during the semester. So, this exam is mostly divided in 5 parts, being the building up section the one in which students tend to fail the most. In this section, students have to write cohesive sentences following some features that are given in order or in disorder. So, for example, students could be given a sentence which says third person plural, possessive adjective, and negative, and compound sentence. In this way, they have to construct a sentence using a third person plural or including a third person plural, using a possessive adjective. The sentence has to be negative, and it has to be a compound sentence. So, according to some teachers of licenciatura en idioma inglés opción enseñanza, students have shown problems solving this section for since 10 years ago. So, some experts agree that the pattern practices and the journal entry practices are the practices that help students to enhance cohesive sentences in the building up section the most. So, we have the type of practices that help students to write cohesive sentences in the building up section of the written test. So, as it is observed, journal entries and pattern practices are the practices that help students to write cohesive sentences. To gather this information, 5 experts were interviewed, and they were also they were asked which type of practices they consider that enhance students to write cohesive sentences. 5 out of 5 experts agreed that pattern practices are the practices that help students the most, since pattern practices are like a simulation of the actual building up section of the written test. Since in pattern practices, students have to solve different sentence patterns in which they are given features which they have to fill up, and they have to create sentences according to those features. Also, 2 out of 5 experts agreed that journal practices help students, since in these practices students are challenged in order to write as most as they can, and in this way students are able to use the features that they have used in the building up patterns, and they use it to write cohesive sentences and that stick together with other sentences. So in this case, they have to use these patterns in context. So in this way, they produce language and use it in context. Based on the opinion of some experts, journal entries and pattern practices are the ones that help students to write cohesive sentences in the written exam. And we have some different opinion of the experts. First, we have expert A that says that there are different types of practices that can be used. One of them is the pattern practices, in which students are asked to construct sentences using or following a specific pattern. Expert B says that since it is a sentences section, teachers need to do a build-up pattern practice. Also, expert C says that what he or she does is to give pattern practices, but apart from that, he or she focuses on what students need to know in order to solve the building of patterns. And he or she also said that sometimes teachers make students build up sentences following some patterns, but they do not go deep in on what students really need to do in that part. So in this case, students need to remember what is the purpose of the building up section. And finally, expert D says that he or she gives them a lot of practices in the virtual classroom. He or she gives them pattern practices, and sometimes the students are the ones that give the teacher the patterns. So they, along with the teacher and the other classmates, solve those practices in order to create sentences. Then we have a description of how journal entries and pattern practices help intensive intermediate English 2 students to write cohesive sentences in the building up section of the written test. So, in order to help intensive intermediate 2 students in their performance of the building up section, the research team carried out 2 types of practices: a pattern practice, and also a journal entry practice. And at the end, the research team made a written test, which was a simulation of the actual building up section, in which students had some time in which they had to fill those patterns, and in which students have to complete the sentences with all the features given. So, we have enhancement of intensive intermediate English 2 students to write cohesive sentences in the building up section of the written test. This is graphic B1. And so, as it can be seen, in the first practice, we have 19 students. So, in the first practice, out of 19 students, 8 students passed the practice and 11 students failed. In the second practice, it was a pattern practice, we had 18 students and 9 students passed and 9 students failed. And finally, in the written test, which was a simulation of the building up section, we had 26 students and 4 students out of 26 passed the test, and 22 students out of 26 failed this test. So not all students were able to create cohesive sentences, and also not all students were able to identify the features. Well, most of the students were actually able to identify the features, but what happened was that students didn't know how to use those features. For example, if they were requested to write a sentence using future for predictions, they knew that they had to use the modal will. However, students would use something like, I can go to the cinema. So they didn't know how to apply those features, but they knew which were the features, but they failed in the application of the grammatical pattern, in the grammatical tenses. Also, another thing that made students fail was time management. So students didn't know, well, they knew how much time they had, but they didn't know how to manage that time. And at the end, they didn't finish the patterns because they didn't have enough time. Then we have enhancement of intensive intermediate 2 students to write cohesive sentences in the building up section. So at the end, the areas that the research team wanted to boost were usage of vocabulary, spelling mistakes, usage of tenses, the topic, since in the journal entry practices, students were given a specific topic which they had to write about, and also cohesive sentences. So as it can be seen, the part in which students failed the most was the vocabulary and also writing cohesive sentences. So most of the students didn't write cohesive sentences because they didn't, and vocabulary was part of that because some of the students didn't write cohesive sentences because they didn't know the vocabulary they were going to use. For example, they had to use a word that was jet lag. They had to use that expression, and students used it in the journal practice, and also they used it in the written evaluation, but they didn't know what that meant. So in that case, they would use jet lag as a noun, as an adverb, or as an adjective. So they didn't know how to use it, and they wouldn't explain they wouldn't express the actual meaning of the expression in the patterns or in the journal practices. And then we have the description of the factors that prevent students to write cohesive sentences in the building of section. So, as this was already said, students take this test and they have to solve building a pattern. So, the majority of the students fail in the actual building up section, and they also failed in the written practices that were given by the research team. So, there are different factors that affect students in this section. So, there were two ways to see which factors affected students. So, according to the teachers, we have this table. According to the teacher, these are the factors that prevent students' performance in the building apps according to the research team. So, according to teacher A, the factors that affect students are lack of vocabulary, poor study habits, poor understanding of grammatical rules. According to teacher B, we have poor understanding of grammatical rules, poor understanding of the given features. According to teacher C, we have lack of vocabulary and poor understanding of grammatical rules. According to teacher D, we have lack of vocabulary, poor study habits, problems in grasping the contents, and problems in grasping the contents. So, in this case, we can see that the factor that affects students the most is the poor understanding of grammatical features and lack of vocabulary, according to teachers. However, according to the research team, according to a questionnaire carried out, the research team realized that the factor that affects the most is the identification and also the understanding of grammatical tenses and also time management. So we have chapter 5, which is the conclusions and recommendations. So after analyzing and organizing all the data, the research team concluded that the type of practices that help intensive intermediate English to students to write cohesive sentences in the building up section of the written test are pattern practices and journal entry practices, since the journal entry practices help students to use language in context by using the features they have learned in the pattern practices, and the pattern practices are an actual simulation of the building up section in the written test. Also, the research team concluded that journal entry practices and pattern practices will enhance students to write cohesive sentences in the building up section, since students are required to use certain features to create their sentences, not only in the pattern practices, but also in the journal entry practices, as it was already explained that for the journal entry practices, students were required to use certain features, certain vocabulary, and certain tenses. According to some experts from the Department of Foreign Languages, some of the factors that prevent students to write cohesive sentences are lack of vocabulary, poor study habits, problems in grasping the contents, poor understanding of grammatical rules, and poor understanding of given features. And finally, the research team concluded that the hypothesis intensive intermediate to students of licenciatura en idioma inglés opción enseñanza will improve the elaboration of cohesive sentences in the building up section of the written exams through the implementation of journal weekly entry and building up pattern practices in classes at the Western Multidisciplinary Campus of the University of El Salvador was found to be partially true, since students did not improve as it was expected in the elaboration of cohesive sentences in the building up section, according to the results gathered at the beginning of the research compared with the last results. Then, the recommendations. The research team recommends that teachers should implement more activities based on the building up section, provide building up hard practices based on the audiolingual approach, which is the approach in which the building up section is based. Provide journal practices in which students are able to connect the features and create sentences in context. Focus on the factors that prevent students to write cohesive sentences in the building up sections. And also, the recommendations are that students should solve more practices besides the ones given in classes to improve their understanding of the grammatical features, their vocabulary, and production of cohesive sentences. Enrich their vocabulary. This could be by solving practices, by reading more, by watching or listening to things that they like. Also, students should consider developing journal entries since students have the opportunity to see how features are connected, how features create different types of sentences in context. And review several times the grammar notes that are being developed by teachers and pay attention to those grammar notes. Then we have the timeline. So the responsible for all the activities were the research team. And the research team formation happened on July 2008. Then the research team chose the topic in the month of August, also in 2018. For the preliminary phase, the approach in the field of study, the diagnostic study, and the definition of the problem also happened on the month of August. And then the literature review and the operationalization of variables happened on the month of September. The elaboration of the thesis protocol and the revision of the thesis protocol happened on the month of November of 2018. And the incorporation of the suggestions made by the thesis advisor happened on September 2018. The elaboration of the data collection instruments and the validation of the data collection instruments happened on November in 2018. And then the execution phase. The data collection procedures, the data processing, the data analysis and interpretation happened in the months of March and April of the year 2019. And finally, for the budget, we have the type of supplies that were used were office supplies. And we have pens, pencils, printer ink, printer paper, and stapler, and printer cartridges, making at the end a total of $146. And finally, we have the services. We have photocopies, internet, other expenses like food, transportation, and electricity, and snacks for the final presentation, which all of that made a cost a total of $649. And well, this was all for our presentation. Thank you very much.